We were expecting Haight-Ashbury to be special, a creative and artistic place filled with beautiful people. George Harrison, British songwriter and lead guitarist of the Beatles, made a visit to the States in 1967. Of particular interest on his itinerary was San Francisco, the hotbed of the Summer of Love movement that was sweeping the nation. The intersection of Haight and Ashbury was the epicenter of the epicenter. This is where Harrison was looking forward to experiencing the utopia of peace and love that his band played no small part in bringing about. It wasn't quite as magical as he had imagined, though. I won't try a British accent here, but he said, "It was horrible, full of ghastly dropouts, bums and spotty youths, all out of their brains. Everybody looked stoned, even mothers and babies. And they were so close behind us that they were treading on the backs of our heels. It got to the point where we couldn't stop for fear of being trampled." He couldn't get out of there fast enough. Unfortunately for the rest of the West, we're still there. The only real magic of the Summer of Love is that it's still going. Our society has been on a 50-year bender, strung out and still trying to prove in the face of a reality that screams otherwise that love is all you need. The wonder years of my youth coincided with a television show by the same name. I was the same age as Kevin Arnold. I had my own Winnie Coopers and Lisa Berlinis and Paul Pfeiffers. I was mainly interested in the school scenes, and I identified with all the angst of adolescence, especially when it came to trying to talk to girls. The perils of his parents and the political stuff went over my head. But now that I'm the age of Kevin's parents, I can appreciate the weightier matters. The show's first season just happens to be set in 1968. There's an episode where Kevin's older sister Karen, a teenager who's clearly been swept up by the hippie movement, falls in love with an activist college student named Louis. Louis drives a colorful van with a large peace sign on the back and doesn't eat meat. One day, Kevin overhears Louis talking to another girl on the phone and he questions him about it. Louis responds, "Your sister and I, we love each other, but it's an open and trusting kind of love. We don't own each other like a farmer owns a cow. I can share love with your sister, and she can share love with me, but that doesn't mean I can't also share love with Marissa." Kevin's mother invites Louis to stay for dinner. While she's preparing food, Louis lets her know, among other things, that a lot of women find it demeaning spending their lives serving their husbands and children. During a dinner discussion about the merits of the Vietnam War, Louis rebuts Kevin's father's argument that freedom and democracy have certain advantages that communist dictatorships don't, by telling him that he's been brainwashed. Karen adds that the US government systematically oppresses Black people, women, and free speech. I didn't know it then, but as far back as 1988 when the show premiered, the writers and producers of the Wonder Years had perfectly picked up on something. They did a wonderful job of capturing the crucibles of youth, yes, but what they did even better was characterizing the philosophical divide between Jack Arnold, who wore brown slacks and a buttoned-up shirt and embodied the hard virtues like truth, justice, reason, lawfulness, and righteousness, and his daughter Karen Arnold, who wore flower garlands and tie-dye dresses and embodied the soft virtues like love, peace, unity, compassion, and kindness. Karen thought Jack was heartless, and Jack thought Karen was brainless, and they both thought they were doing the right thing. Being set in the immediate aftermath of the Summer of Love, the show was a time capsule from the most recent turning point of Western civilization. In 1988, we were still waiting in the shallow end of the ramifications of what I'll deem, for reasons I'll explain below, the Great Turn. It would be another generation before we would fully experience the effects. But for all intents and purposes, before the Summer of Love, the Western world was Jack Arnold, and after, it was Karen. People had a lot to be upset about in the 1960s. They had been through 2 world wars. They had just been through the Korean War, where tens of thousands of American soldiers died. They were in the midst of another war in Vietnam, which would claim tens of thousands more. They were in the middle of the Cold War and living under constant threat of the mighty Soviet Union. They grew up doing duck and cover drills in school, rehearsing what to do in case of a nearby nuclear explosion. No wonder they wanted gun barrels to sprout only flowers. But it wasn't just war that defined the modern era that dates from the 17th century to the love revolution of the late 1960s. It was the Enlightenment. It was the Age of Reason. It was the scientific and industrial revolutions. Competition and capitalism proliferated new technology across the globe. All of these things were brought about in the pursuit of the hard virtues. Scholarship was propagating the promise that utopia was coming through scientific advancements. The human race was supposed to have its watershed moment. We were finally smart enough to build paradise. We just had to capture the maxims and master the formulas. But with the age of reason came debates about whose reason was supreme. Liberalism, socialism, conservatism, communism, fascism, nationalism, and a host of other isms all competed for hearts and minds. It turned out that science wasn't the savior after all. Our formulas made vaccines for smallpox, but they also made atomic bombs. We learned how to fly people through the sky, but we also learned how to stack them in mass graves. 3 centuries and change into the modern era, and not only had utopia not materialized, but our battlefields were bloodier than ever. Leading up to the 60s, homes were likely to be led by a conscientious, demanding figure. He worked hard and he meant business. He expected fairness in a merit-based system. He loved his country and probably spent hard time in the service of defending it. He revered the institution of the family. He expected order in the home and lawfulness in his city. He told the truth and expected to be told the truth. His kids respected his authority and did their chores accordingly. If you lived under his roof, you would live under his rules. He was probably too strict at times and not as flexible as he could have been when things didn't align just as he'd liked. He wasn't too concerned with social justice issues. He didn't have time for small talk or the arts. He was j.ournal. And so the stage was set. By 1967, the world was ready for a great rebellion, a great turn. Karen was ready to pounce. Isaac Newton, one of the key figures in kicking off the previous turn of the modern era, declared in 1687 that every action would have an equal and opposite reaction. Little did he know of the reaction that would occur at the end of his era, the reaction that would birth the postmodern era. Your sons and daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times, they are a-changing. Bob Dylan. The times were a-changing indeed. In a grand and expeditious backlash to the fact-focused modern era, the new age of feeling sprung into action with the summer of love. The modern era was too heartless with its reason and righteousness. The hippies had the answer, the true path to utopia. Love. Love is all you need. Love will save the world. The seminal celebration would be an orgy of love and peace and drugs in the streets of San Francisco. But these passing pleasures were not all that would be partaken of. For the movement to last beyond the summer, all would have to vigorously embrace the soft virtues and vehemently reject the hard virtues. Truth was the first virtue that had to go, for truth is divisive by nature, and the New Age was all about peace and harmony. The j.ournals of the world valued things like hard work and discipline, so those had to be discarded. The parents of the 50s preached that sex should be had only with your lawfully wedded spouse. So in the New Age, sex must be had with anyone and everyone. It's now seen as downright preposterous to wait for marriage to have sex. Whatever was previously perceived as righteous, the flower children must do the opposite. Drugs were necessary to free the mind of old rules and restrictions. Influencers of the day encouraged the youth to drop out of school and be free and open-minded. In response to Jack's facts not caring about your feelings, Karen's feelings didn't care about your facts. The West drunk so deeply of the spirits of 67 that we're still having a hangover. All of our institutions imbibed, and thus the following generations would all receive souvenirs from the summer of love. Everything that was passed down, from sexual mores to political policy to church sermons, to what we put in our TV shows and movies, it would all be saturated with the soft virtues. Did the New Age of love save the world? Well, let's just say that if the ghost of George Harrison were to visit the West in 2023, it wouldn't look a whole lot different from what he saw strung out in the streets of Haight and Ashbury. It's no surprise that we find ourselves wanting to hightail it out of here, too. If only it were as easy for us. Here are some highlights from the Great Turn. Violent crime nearly quadrupled in the US between the 60s and its peak in the 1990s. Abortion was made legal in 1967 in the UK, and in 1973 in the United States. The rest of the West followed suit throughout the 70s and 80s. There have been 65 million abortions in the US alone since the Summer of Love. Today, over 20% of US pregnancies end in abortion. For the children who are allowed to be born, they're more than twice as likely to be raised by a single parent than they were in 1968. Abolishing the pesky plague of abstinence brought an abundance of sexually transmitted diseases. No longer burdened with repressing lust, people were now free to enjoy HIV and syphilis. Health class curriculums were revamped to teach that life can be discarded as if you accidentally took a piece of fruit that you didn't like in the lunch line. Chastity was chastised at the altars of Hugh Hefner. Rules of sexual engagement were adopted from pornography. Singers and rappers competed to see who could be the nastiest, and today they're given awards for their debauchery. The promises of promiscuity never came true, though. The sexual revolution's first commandment is that women were sexually available at all times did not bring bliss. Self-reported happiness levels have tanked since the 60s, especially, and not surprisingly, amongst women. Prophylactics were proliferated, but none of them protected a single heart. Treating each other as bodies without faces and calling it love has left the West wrought with rejection and trust issues, low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, broken families, fatherlessness, and perhaps worst of all, emptiness. No, the Summer of Love didn't save the world any more than the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution did. But it definitely swung the pendulum of cultural norms, and there's been no stopping it since. Its momentum affects every aspect of our present moment. We think the absurdity of the 2020s came out of left field, but really, it's all precisely predictable once we understand the origins of our era. Once we understand that we've all been kidnapped by a well-meaning man in a colorful van and told that love is all we need. Once we understand that we are all the ideological offspring of the Summer of Love, it all makes sense. It makes perfect sense that love is the mantra of our day. Cyclically meaningless, yes, but it sounds good. And what more of a peaceful and loving thing to say than love is love? It makes perfect sense that 2 + 2 is whatever one is comfortable with because it's more loving to affirm all answers. It makes perfect sense to replace equality with equity. Equality means equal opportunity. And with equal opportunity, some will succeed more than others. And that would lead to hurt feelings, and it's more loving to prevent all hurt feelings. It makes perfect sense to abolish police and prisons. It's more loving to not put people in jail. It makes perfect sense that sitcoms would switch the father knows best character with the father is an idiot character. This is Karen's world now, and anyone in the position of authority or who would have someone live by rules must be mocked into oblivion. We must smash the patriarchy. It makes perfect sense that masculinity would be demonized. Men who are naturally competitive, independent, and non-compliant get in the way of the utopia of soft virtues. Because the hard virtues are seen as defects, boys are treated like defective girls. More femininity is always the answer to every problem that still ails society. And it makes perfect sense that we can't define what a woman or a man is. Facts are no match for feelings. In the postmodern era, compassion must trump reason. It makes perfect sense that long-standing axioms like the gender binary would have to be dismantled or queered, as it is said. There cannot be any absolute truths in postmodernism. It makes perfect sense that we keep inching towards normalizing pedophilia. Love is love, and love knows no boundaries. It makes perfect sense to push for controlled speech, because if we all say the same things, we will supposedly have peace and unity. It doesn't really matter what we say as long as it's the same. We don't want to rock the boat. Cancel culture is the natural outcome of this system. If a society has rejected the virtue of truth, it will hate those that speak it. It makes perfect sense to be anti-small business and pro-communism. People having their own businesses leads to financial inequalities. So to maintain economic peace and unity, we should have the government control the economy and distribute everything equally. It makes perfect sense to have digital money. That way people can be rewarded for behaviors that are conducive to collectivism and punished for those that aren't. It makes perfect sense to see the rise of globalism and organizations like the World Economic Forum that offer a great reset to rid the world of any remnant of individualism, including any possessions. You'll own nothing and be happy. It makes perfect sense that in the postmodern era, churches are much more likely to preach kindness, mercy, and moral relativism, whereas in the previous modern era, churches were likely to preach righteousness, justice, and moral absolutism. Of course, it makes sense to just stamp out religion altogether unless it's some sort of watered-down world religion that makes no actual truth claims. If All You Need Is Love is the theme song for the postmodern era, Imagine is the encore. Note what John Lennon, another member of the Beatles, wanted to get rid of so that the world would live as one. Imagine there's no heaven, no religion. Imagine there's no countries. Imagine no possessions. In a short song, he couldn't list everything he wanted to abolish. But in 2020, in its own ode to the summer of love, the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture would publicize a list of the following loathsome virtues in an attempt to slander whiteness: individualism, self-reliance, the nuclear family, the scientific method, objective truth, hard work, religion, specifically Christianity, respect for authority, delayed gratification, planning for the future, being on time, justice, personal possessions, controlling yourself, and competition. They could have just posted a picture of j.ournal with a gun to his head. It all makes perfect sense, even when it doesn't make any sense at all. Confronted with paradoxes and pitfalls like affirming someone's belief that they have wings when they're standing on the precipice of a 10-story building, people just throw their hands up and say, love. It was for love. It was for love and bloody peace. It was a fabulous time. I even get excited now when I realize what it was for. Peace and love. People putting flowers in guns. Ringo Starr on Why the Beatles made Love Is All You Need. Just before the credits roll on Season 1, Episode 4 of The Wonder Years, Lewis's colorful van pulls up in front of the Arnold's home. Before she gets out, a devastated Karen turns to him and says, "You told me that you loved her, but you never told me you were sleeping with her." She's left sobbing alone on the same lawn where earlier in the episode she merrily strummed her guitar and made out with Lewis. Free love, that is, love detached from responsibility, isn't really love, of course. It's just an empty promise. Peace detached from principle is meaningless. Compassion detached from reason is frivolous. Feelings detached from facts are fruitless. When any virtue is taken too far, it becomes a vice. And what we're living through is all of the soft virtues being taken too far at the same time. We're in that vice. Love is all you need sounded great at the beginning of the episode, but now we're sobbing on the lawn. I'm not arguing that one set of virtues is better than the other. A virtue is a virtue. It's the going too far with one set and the forsaking of all the others that gets us into trouble. For example, we all know the final line from the story in the Bible about the woman caught in adultery. Jesus said, "I don't condemn you. Go and sin no more." The first part is compassion. This is Karen. She wouldn't condemn. She'd say that anything goes. The second part is righteousness. This is Jack. He'd lay down the law. The truth is that Jesus exhibited both righteousness and compassion. He was always loving, but he also always told the truth. He was merciful beyond our comprehension, but never did he hide the reality of God's justice. He always perfectly exemplified that it's actually more compassionate to tell someone the truth than to let them live a lie. And it's actually more truthful to be compassionate than to condemn someone. This is why he's the way. The more we follow him, the less susceptible we are to these extremes. If someone were naturally inclined toward the hard virtues, they would learn about God being gracious and merciful, slow to anger and great in loving kindness, and that we should be merciful, even as our Father in heaven is merciful. If someone were naturally inclined toward the soft virtues, they would learn about the feelings of rejecting truth and learn that true, lasting love and peace come in the pursuit of righteousness. Truth without grace, and I won't listen. Grace without truth, and I won't change. To be honest, I don't remember being particularly fond of either Jack or Karen, probably because they were overly caricaturized. But I think their best moments came when they saw the merits of each other's virtues. Jack was most likable when he softened up a bit, and Karen was most likable when she acknowledged that the rules of morality existed for a reason. The soft virtues are not bad, but our age has indulged to them to a fault, a dangerous fault. And our current plight is to bring the pendulum back to the center and take care not to swing it to the other apex. Love is not all we need. Truth is not all we need. Mercy is not all we need. Justice is not all we need. Compassion is not all we need. Righteousness is not all we need. Feelings are not all we need, and facts are not all we need. It doesn't make for as catchy of a tune, but Jesus is all we need.